Today, we're going to be talking about understanding the ADA's physical accessibility requirements for libraries. My name is Robin Jones, and I am the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center, which is one of the 10 federally funded technical assistance centers on the Americans with Disabilities Act. As we go through today, we be thinking about things that you might have as questions, etc., as we will have another opportunity to address those questions in the future. Just to start, the ADA is a civil rights law. That is the key, most fundamental thing to really think about when you talk about the ADA. It's not an entitlement law. It's not a law that provides any financial access or anything. It basically is a civil rights law in the context that it promotes non-discrimination on the basis of disability. It promotes integration versus segregation in how we perform and provide our programs, services, and activities. It has as a principle that equal access is what is required, not just better access. And it's based on the principles of the 60s civil rights movement. Please keep in mind again that the ADA is not an unfunded mandate. We've come a long way since the ADA was passed and prior to the ADA in regards to how we're serving and working with people with disabilities. We have gone from not being welcomed at all to now making positive marketing statements that we identify ourselves as disability friendly and identify what types of accommodations and things that we have available. We've gone from no access with stairs and lack of ramps and things of that nature to where now we're building access for everyone. We're embracing universal design, where we're incorporating designs that everyone can use, not just a few. And we're looking from the issues of having a separate entrance for people with disabilities to having an entrance that is available for everyone to use. These are important concepts to keep in mind as we go through today, because really what we're building on is the fact that most accessibility that you build into your facilities or you modify to increase your facilities access will benefit everyone, not just individuals with disabilities. From a manual card catalog in your libraries to electronic catalogs. We will not be talking about these other aspects of your compliance in regards to things like your websites and stuff of that nature, but it's important to keep in mind that as you move and as we evolve in society, there will be forever changes in how we do business, and that also should incorporate how we do business and involve people with disabilities. So I'm going to start with just a discussion about what laws apply. We start back with the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was passed in 1973. This is a law that basically is looked at from a carrot and a stick perspective. It applies to recipients of federal funds, and it states that they cannot discriminate on the basis of disability in their programs, services, and facilities. It doesn't matter who gets the federal funds. If your entity even gets $1 of federal funds for a special program or anything of that nature, all of your programs and services are covered under Section 504. The standard for accessibility that is used for Section 504 is the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standard, or UFAS for short. Then we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990, which really kind of started to overshadow Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, even though the Section 504 still is there and still is a core function and a core responsibility of your entities. With the passage of the ADA, we no longer had that tie to federal funds for your obligations to ensure that you do not discriminate on the basis of disability. Now, any local or state government entity has the responsibilities to ensure that all of their programs, services, and activities are readily accessible to and usable by persons with disabilities. The accessibility standard that is used under the ADA is known as ADA Accessibility Standard, which was passed in 2010. There was a previous standard in 1991, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's also very important to keep in mind that as the state of Wisconsin has gone forward, it has its own accessibility requirements in its building code. I should remind you that the ADA and Section 504 do not have a building code. The standards that are available and are required to be followed under Section 504 and the ADA are just that, they are standards, they're not a building code. Whereas the state of Wisconsin has a building code that is triggered on in regards to anything that is built or modified in the state of Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin has continually updated its accessibility code. It currently references the 2015 International Building Code as the core of the Wisconsin Building Code, with what we call Wisconsinisms added onto that. And this building code requires all sites, buildings, structures, facilities, elements, and spaces, temporary or permanent, to be accessible to individuals with disabilities. One of the biggest application differences of the state of Wisconsin's building code versus the ADA is the fact that the state of Wisconsin does not have exemptions that exist under the ADA for things like religious entities or tribal entities, etc. The state of Wisconsin's building code is much broader in its application. Our focus today and my discussion is going to be on the 2010 ADA standards. These are the architectural accessibility requirements for existing facilities as well as new construction, and we will talk about how that makes that distinction. Some of the definitions and implementation dates important to start with in regards to this issue is we look at this concept of an existing facility. Well, what is an existing facility? An existing facility is any facility that was constructed prior to January 26 of 1992 and has not undergone any renovation. A renovation or an addition, as it would be looked at under the ADA and would trigger the ADA's requirements, would be any renovation or addition that occurred in a facility after January 26 of 1992. New construction under the ADA, and what would again trigger the ADA requirements, was any facility that was constructed for first occupancy after January 26 of 1993. Now, the 2010 standards, which is our focus of our discussion today, is applicable for anything that had a start date of construction and or renovation that occurred after March 15th of 2012. Prior to that time, there would have been the ADA accessibility guidelines of 1991, and we'll talk a little bit further about that in a minute here. So when we look at things being non-complying, and we're trying to bring them up to compliance with the ADA, if the building was, and what was built or constructed was before March 15th, 2012, entities had the choice to use the 1991 standards or the 2010 standards or UFAS, the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, if they were a Title II entity. If they were doing work on that building that was non-conforming or non-complying with the ADA after March 15th of 2012, they had to bring anything that was a non-compliance into compliance with the 2010 standards. What's important to understand about this, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, is the issue of safe harbor when the 2010 standards were passed. In that, let's say I had a facility that was non-compliant and I still had barriers that existed, and let's say my entrances weren't accessible or whatever else it might be. If it was built prior to March 15th of 2012, I needed to look at how and what I do to make that come into compliance and apply that standard. When the 2010 ADA standards were passed, they implemented what was called safe harbor. And that is the facilities that were not compliant with the 1991 standards, that are compliant with the 1991 standards, do not need to be brought up to the 2010 standards until they go under renovation. So an example would be of that. In the 1991 standards or guidelines for accessibility, you only had to have 50% of your entrances accessible. When the 2010 ADA standards were implemented, you had to have 60% of your entrances accessible. So if I had 2 entrances under the 1991, I would have only had to have 1 accessible. If I had 2 entrances under the 2010 ADA standards, both of them would have to be accessible. However, if I already had my 1 entrance accessible according to the 1991 standards, just because the 2010 standards came into existence did not mean I suddenly had to go back and make that 2nd entrance accessible. Only when I went to go and do any kind of a renovation of my facility, would I then trigger that 60% requirement and have to bring that up to the standards of the 2010 standards of having 60%, or in this case, 2 of my entrances or both of my entrances accessible. The safe harbor, however, does not apply to any elements in existing facilities that did not have technical or scoping specifications in the 1991 standards. What I mean by that, when the 1991 ADA guidelines were put out, they did not have all or every bit of facility or type of facility covered in the 1991 guidelines. In the 2010, they expanded what was covered under the ADA standards to include things like play areas, swimming pools, recreation areas, etc. And so if I had, let's say, as a library, a play area as part of my facility, I would need to bring that up to the 2010 standards in order to be compliant with the ADA, because there wasn't one in 1991. So I would need to meet that 2010 standard. I would not qualify for the safe harbor. As I talk today and as I go through these requirements, I'm going to start from outside the building and work into the building and how the building is used by individuals. So what that obviously means parking. Now, not every library is going to have parking. Depends on where you're located. You may have just street parking, which you don't control, the city controls, etc. But if you have a parking lot, you are subject to the ADA's requirements to ensure that your parking lot has the correct number of accessible parking spaces, as well as having van accessible parking spaces, depending upon how many overall parking spaces you have. So for example, under this chart, you'll see that for every 25 parking spaces, you have to have at least 1 accessible parking space. For every 25 parking spaces, you have to have at least 1 van accessible parking space, which means that you would need to actually have 2 parking spaces in that 1 to 25. One that was accessible, and the second one that was van accessible. And as you can see, you go up again, 26 to 50, you'll see that it gradually increases, and you don't see it more than 1 additional van accessible space until you get to a larger parking lot where we start to get over 200 spaces, and then it goes up from there. The only exception under the ADA in terms of accessible parking spaces, and it's really not an exception, but a different way to address them, is in a situation where I have fewer than 5 parking spaces. I'm still required to have an accessible parking space, but I don't have to have a sign on it dedicating it to be a reserved parking, accessible parking space. The rationale behind that is when you have fewer than 5 parking spaces, that if one was designated as accessible space, that would really limit significantly the number of parking spaces that you would have available for your tenants. And you may not have somebody using the accessible parking space all the time. So I need to have the accessible parking space in case somebody needs it if it's vacant, but I do not have to make it a reserved parking space. That is one exception that exists in the parking space requirements. The dimensions of an ADA parking space, again, as you indicated previously, you've got an accessible parking space, and then you have a van accessible parking space. The rationale behind this is you need a larger space for individuals who are driving a van, and when you're using a lift that they have to deploy in order to exit the vehicle. When an individual is exiting a regular vehicle from the front seat or the back seat, they don't need the same amount of width in order to deploy their wheelchair and transfer into that wheelchair. However, when you have a van that has a lift on it, that lift has to come out, and that lift needs the space and clearance to allow the lift to be able to deploy, and then the person to exit from the van on the lift and still be free of any other vehicles or any other obstructions. So you see in my diagram that you've got on the left, 2 accessible parking spaces with an access aisle in between. Those 2 accessible parking spaces can share that access aisle. They have a sign then that designates it as a car parking sign or car accessible parking space for a car. The van accessible parking space on the right shows a 8-foot parking space, but I now have to have an 8 8-foot access aisle versus the 5-foot access aisle to give that additional space required for someone to exit their vehicle in with that lift being deployed. And you will see then that you can share that access aisle between 2 spaces if you're required to have 2 spaces. So you could actually have one car space on the left and a wheelchair space on the right, but if you would have to have 2 separate access aisles in that situation, because the 5-foot access aisle for the regular parking space could not be shared with the van accessible space because it wouldn't be large enough. You could put a 8-foot access aisle between the regular space and the van accessible space, because that would be a size that could be used by both the van as well as the regular car parking space. I'm going to talk about elements of an accessible route, because once I've parked, how am I going to get into the facility, and what kind of path of travel do I have to ensure that somebody has so that it's accessible, so that they can move around within the facility and the boundaries of that facility. Under entrances, under the 1991, as I referenced earlier, you're only required to have 50% of your public entrances accessible. Under the 2010, you have to have 60% accessible. And where you have entrances that are not accessible, you must provide signage to indicate where the location of the accessible entrance is. You also need to ensure that your hardware is accessible, in that individuals are able to open the door with what we would refer to as a closed fist. The closed fist rule means that how can I don't need to have or do any twisting or pinching or anything of that nature on the hardware in order to engage it. This applies to both interior and exterior doors. Doors have to be a minimum of 36 inches of clear width. If it's an interior door, it must have an opening force maximum of 5 pounds of pressure. There are no exterior door opening forces under the ADA. Revolving doors are not considered to be accessible entrances, even if you purchased an accessible revolving door. The ADA accessibility standards, as well as the Wisconsin building code, do not recognize revolving doors as accessible entrances. If I have a revolving door, I must have an accessible door adjacent to the revolving door. Any security ballots or screening devices cannot obstruct the accessible route through or in the door. And where present, at least one of any restricted entrances must be accessible as well. We'll often see that we have a restricted entrance, possibly for staff only, or a locked entry or something after hours or whatever that might be. That entrance still needs to be accessible, and it must have a two-way communication device that is also accessible to alert somebody who may need assistance at that restricted entrance. We get a lot of questions about automatic and power-assisted doors. Clarify that they are not required under the ADA or the Wisconsin Building Code. They are a tool to increase the accessibility of your entrances. They are used by a broad array of people, and you'll see many facilities, stores, etc., who have implemented and use automatic doors. They serve mothers with children in strollers. They serve individuals who have their hands full. They serve people in wheelchairs. They have who have difficulty opening the doors, etc. They serve your salespeople, your delivery people. There's really a broad array of people who are served by an automatic door or a power-assisted door. If you have one, they must meet the ADA standards for the push plates and having the access for that. And if you look at my picture or my photo that I have here, it's an example of a automatic door, but and below that it says the door must stay open for 2 to 3 seconds. However, we recommend 5 seconds minimally is recommended. If you noticed, it's hard to see a little bit, but to the left, you will see that's where the push button is to open this particular door. You will see in this particular situation that somebody has positioned a wheelchair right in front of that door. This is a wheelchair that is used by individuals who might be visiting the facility, et cetera, and may need that kind of assistance. By placing that wheelchair in front of that push plate, you've essentially made that automatic door inaccessible. Now, there's many ways for automatic doors or power assisted doors to work. Some are operated by an electric eye, some are operated by a trigger on the floor that when you roll over it or pressure is placed on it, etc. That's really up to the establishment and what works best for them. But if I do have push plates, we have to make sure that they are located in a place that's accessible and that they're maintained as accessible. With COVID, we've seen a lot of touch-free things being implemented, and you'll see on the lower left my image of a push button that is waved to open. Instead of having to push it, you wave in front of it. Your arm or any thing going in front of it will trigger that door to open. Now, good or bad, depending on your situation. If you're in an environment that has a lot of things that might be wind and such that might be flying by your doors, that wave to open might be problematic, although you can set the sensitivity for that. When you talk about the route to get into the door or get up to the door, we talk about the width of an accessible route. The minimum width of an accessible route is 36 inches, and that route must be maintained at all times. The only time that you can reduce a route to 32 inches is at a doorway or other areas for a maximum of 24 inches. So you can, if you look at my diagram, the doorway has to be 36 inches. I can reduce that to 32 inches. So for example, when the door is in the open position, that the actual door and the width of the door is going to infringe on that 36 inches. So I'm going to reduce it down because of that. I can have that reduction for a maximum of 24 inches. So you could have areas or places within the library where you might have stacks or something of that nature. The maximum, again, that you could reduce to below 36 inches would be for a 24-inch length. All surfaces must be firm and slip resistance. This gets down to the type of flooring that you use, the surface that you use. Even the use of carpeting can be problematic if the carpeting is too thick or has a thick pad below it. So the ADA really uses this coefficient of surface must be firm and slip resistant. There are very specific coefficients in the ADA related to the amount of thickness that you can have in regards to any kind of flooring, and we will refer you to those if you were thinking about replacing any carpeting or any kind of, or installing any kind of padding on your floors. Oftentimes we'll see a ramp as part of a path of travel. A ramp is required anytime there's a change in level that is greater than half of an inch. A lot of times in older facilities, we'll see where we've tried to bridge situations where old and new, et cetera, and we might have a change in level. And again, if it is between a quarter an inch and a half an inch, it must bevel that change in level. But if it's greater than a half inch, I must have a ramp. Ramp is looked at in the context of length or the slope of that ramp, and that would be determined by the rise of what I'm trying to bridge. So for example, if I have a 2-inch rise, that means a 2-inch lip, then I would have to have 24 inches of slope. So when you look at it, you take your rise by your length, will get what your slope is in your ramp, and it is 1 in 12 is the ratio. The minimum width of a ramp is 32 inches, and handrails are required on both sides of ramps that have a rise of greater than 6 inches. So if my ramp has a rise of less than, so if, let's say I only have 3 inches that I'm trying to bridge with a ramp, I would not be required to have handrails. But if I had 6 inches or more of, let's say a full step that I'm trying to bridge with a ramp, I would be required to have handrails on both sides. We get a lot of questions about elevators and where they are required. There's a difference between private sector buildings and public sector buildings. Public sector or governmentally owned and operated buildings with 1 or more story must have an elevator. The only exception is that you're not required to have access to non-public floors with a maximum occupancy of 5, such as a catwalk or potentially a mezzanine. In private sector buildings, They're required to have an elevator if they have 3 or more stories. The only exception is buildings that have less than 3 stories or less than 3,000 square foot per floor. Vertical and inclined platform lifts are allowed, but are very limited in when and where they can be used. I can use a vertical or a platform lift versus an elevator in existing facilities, or in new construction, I can use them to access things like performance areas on a stage, jury boxes in a courthouse, or certain recreational facilities such as amusement rides and things like that, but very restricted in where they're able to be used. And when I talk about a vertical or an inclined platform lift, I'm talking about a lift that will hold or support a wheelchair. A chair lift that might go along a stairway, etc., would be something that somebody would sit on, so oftentimes used in homes, but we do see them sometimes applied in commercial or other settings, would not be allowed under the ADA, as it would require somebody to transfer out of their wheelchair into that chair in order to use it. And you have to allow the person to travel with their wheelchair from floor or level to level. Path of travel in a library is also unique because you're also dealing with a lot of things like your aisles with your books or your shelving and things of that nature. So again, looking at it, 36 inches minimum, but please note that minimum clear width of 42 inches is preferred where possible. So these are recommendations that appear in the ADA. The 36 inches is the minimum, so that's the absolute, but it does provide guidance and state that minimum clearance of an aisle 42 inches is preferred where possible. Again, thinking about how somebody uses that space, and somebody may want to turn towards the books, towards the catalog, or whatever else is on display. If I am minimally 36 inches wide, the individual has very little latitude to be able to shift and look to the side. And depending on my abilities and my disability, I may not be able to turn my trunk or shift my body to be able to see something that was to my side. So allowing for that 42 inches allows me some latitude to be able to shift the angle and direction of my chair. It's not going to give me enough to turn around or anything, but it does give me more latitude for movement, and also allows other persons to pass by me who might be ambulating versus when it's 36 inches minimum and you have somebody in a wheelchair, they're basically going to take up the whole aisle, and other people trying to walk down that aisle are going to have difficulty and have to move out and wait for them. So just thinking about flow of traffic as well. These are the required turning and maneuvering clearances under the ADA. So when I think about the end of a row, I need to either provide a 360-degree turning radius for someone to change direction, and or a turning radius that would allow for a T-turn, which is my eye diagram in the upper right-hand side. If I want to allow sufficient passage for 2 wheelchairs to pass in the same aisle area, I would need to design and think about having minimally 60 inches to allow that to occur. So as I'm designing or I'm laying out, I need to really keep in mind, am I maintaining these turning and maneuvers and clearances? Am I not making sure I don't put any temporary displays or anything of that nature at end of rows or anything of that nature that would impede upon that path of travel and interfere with any maneuvering or turning clearances that are required? I'm going to talk for a minute about employee work areas because these are just as important as our public areas. There are some restrictions and limitations, however, in regards to what do I need to do. Even if you don't currently employ a person with a disability, the ADA requires that you design such that so someone would be able to enter, approach, and exit a work area. And when I have a area that is a work area that's greater than 1,000 square feet, I need to make sure that I'm also providing circulation paths. This would be an area that might have cubicles or something of that nature, or multiple desks in an area. I need to make sure that I am allowing circulation paths to be able to get in and around that area. I need to provide a means of egress from an employee work area. And I also need to make sure that it has visual alarm connection. Again, for new construction. In existing facilities, I would not be triggering this requirement. I would be addressing that issue as a reasonable accommodation for an employee. But in a new construction situation, all my visual alarms would have to be present in my office areas. It would not be something that I would only install when I would hire somebody who might be deaf or hard of hearing. When we look at the requirement for access of approach, entry, and exit, again, my door maneuvering clearance on the exterior side of the door needs to be available so that someone can approach and enter the door. I have to have a compliant door with adequate width. That means all my doors have to be a minimum of 32 inches wide, clear opening. My hardware needs to be accessible, and the opening force on the door can be no greater than 5 pounds. I need to have clear floor space within the door on the other side of the door on the interior side. And it's recommended that there is interior door maneuvering clearance and turning space, but it's not required. I just have to allow the person to be able to enter and maneuver and exit. I don't have to provide access to their desk, a table, a chair, or anything of that nature. Again, if I have an employee with a disability, that would become a reasonable accommodation issue of how the interior of that office was designed. But the thought and the rationale behind this requirement is that individuals with disabilities would be able to go to the offices of peers to meet with them if necessary, and at least get inside the door and back out again. This is an example of the circulation path I was talking about. Again, looking at if I had cubicles or multiple desks in an area, and making sure that there was a clear path to link me to any equipment or anything, as well as have an area that I would be able to exit. Some of our libraries have assembly areas, some of them don't. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the issue of assembly areas. If you have fixed seating, if this is an assembly area, a large group room, an open space, etc., if there's fixed seating in that space, you must have designated wheelchair and adjacent companion seating. The ADA does not regulate furniture that is movable. So it does not have any specific requirements for kinds of chairs, types of chairs, or anything that you have to have in these assembly areas if they are movable. However, if they fixed, you do have to have a designated wheelchair space and an adjacent companion seating. The companion seating could be removable seating, or it could be a fixed seat for the companion. There has to be at least one companion seat for each accessible seat. If there is any type of elevation in that assembly area, you must provide a line of sight over any other seated persons for persons with disabilities, which often means that you have to have a raised area for seating for people with disabilities so that they would be able to see over the heads of other seated persons. If you have fixed seating, you also have to ensure that 5% of your aisle seats are designated aisle seats, and as such have foldable or retractable armrests if there are armrests provided. The rationale behind this is to allow somebody who would be able to transfer out of their wheelchair to be able to transfer and not be impaired by a armrest. So if you do have fixed seats, they have armrests, you would need to designate at least 5% of your aisle seats as designated aisle seats with foldable, retractable armrests. If you have seating that does not have armrests, this would not be required, and you do not have to do anything with a designated aisle seat. I'm going to move on to restrooms. Single user or multiple stall restrooms. Again, a stall width minimally needs to be 60 inches. The toilet needs to be from 16 to 18 inches from the center line to the wall. And there must be clearance for a side approach. So you can't only provide clearance for somebody to pull up in a front approach because not everybody can transfer that way. So a side approach is required. There's also very specific requirements in regards to where you would mount the grab bars, both in the front and behind the toilet, as well as mounting any kind of receptacles such as toilet paper dispensers, or any other kind of receptacle that you might have in the bathroom. We strongly discourage the mounting of any kind of baby changing stations inside accessible stalls. If you do that, you must have a larger stall because you have to make sure that there's clear floor space for the changing table when the changing table is in the down position for somebody in a wheelchair to be able to maneuver, because they may also have a child who they need to use that changing table for. All your lavatories and dispensers need to be accessible. Minimally one lavatory in each bathroom has to meet the ADA's requirements for accessibility. And at least one of all of your dispensers need to meet the requirements for ADA accessibility for reach range, which is a maximum of 48 inches to the operable part. We strongly recommend you do not mount anything at 48 inches maximum, because that is the highest level and it's going to be difficult for a lot of people. We recommend that you look to something at the 36 to 40 inches reach range for operable parts instead of the 48-inch max. Max is just that, it's max. Don't go to the max. We highly recommend that you do below that. Where you have multiple toilet stalls, you have to have at least one wheelchair accessible compartment. If you have a urinal, you have to have, if you have more than one urinal, you have to have a accessible urinal. Where you have only one urinal, you're not required to, as long as you have an accessible toilet stall. You have to have, again, at least one compliant lavatory that is not located in a toilet compartment. Sometimes we see entities want to put a lavatory inside the accessible toilet stall. That's fine, you can do that, but that does not remove the requirement for a accessible lavatory in the open space to be used as well. Not everybody who has a disability and needs that accessible lavatory may use that accessible toilet stall. Or they're not necessarily needing to use the toilet, they may just need to use the lavatory. Lavatories are used for a lot of different reasons, not just for washing your hands after you've used the bathroom. So it's really important to make sure that you have those elements in place and that you have the turning radius for individuals to be able to maneuver within the toilet area, toilet room. If you're using single user toilet rooms, we're seeing more and more that a lot of existing facilities are not able to make their existing bathrooms accessible. So they often will construct a single user toilet room, could be gender neutral. Family toilet room, we see a lot of different names used for these. This would be basically where your single user, it's not designated, or it could be designated as long as you have multiple. And the stall width, again, needs to be minimum 60 inches for the actual stall area. The reach range, again, the range for the toilet center line, 16 to 18 inches, but the lavatory cannot overlap the toilet clearance. So this means where it looks like you have to have your lavatory outside of the toilet clearance. So your width of the actual full toilet room is larger, and your door swing cannot swing into the clearance of the toilet or the sink. So you, again, is where you have to have a larger room because of that. Where you have multiple single user toilet rooms that are clustered together, 50% of them must be accessible. So let's say you had 4 single user toilet rooms, 2 of those would have to be accessible. Other elements that I'm going to cover in today are things like signage, water fountains, fire alarms, area of refuge, desks, book drops, tables, kiosks, and self-service stations. Starting with signs or signage, the ADA is very specific about signage. You are required to have tactile and visual signs labeling all permanent rooms and spaces. The Department of Justice and the U.S. Access Boards have identified and defined permanent rooms and spaces to include rooms that have numbers, exits, and restrooms. When I talk about rooms with numbers, the room has to have a number to it. So if it's just a boardroom and it's not assigned a number of room 230, then you would not have to have boardroom in tactile. If it did, however, have boardroom and underneath that room 320, the room number 320 would have to be in Braille, but boardroom would not have to be. The idea behind that, or the rationale, is that what that room is used for, or how you label that room could change over time. But a room that's been assigned a number is considered to be a permanent space designation of a room number. I'm only required to have visual elements meet the ADA requirements for directional or informational signage, and that includes character height, contrast, etc. I'm not required to have tactile for any directional or informational signs. Signs that are exempt from any of the ADA's requirements are temporary signs, building menus, directories, addresses of your building, etc., company names, and any logos. Those are exempt from any of the requirements under the ADA for signage. Not that we wouldn't encourage you to look, as you look at contrast and you look at size of your characters and things when you are mounting those kinds of signs, to be useful to people with disabilities, but they are not required to meet those requirements. Fire alarms are, where required under the local fire code, must meet the NAPA requirements. The ADA did not write its own requirements for this, technical requirements. It refers to the National Fire Protection Association requirements, and it requires and addresses flash rate and pulse duration. This is to address issues of potential setting off or triggering seizures for individuals. It dictates the location, whether it's on a wall or ceiling. It requires and dictates the minimum intensity that is required. It also addresses larger coverage with fewer appliances depending on line of sight. And it, with that, looks at that many spaces other than quarters can be covered by one appliance, depending again on any line of sight. If you have posts or pillars and things of that nature in your room, you may be required to have more than one in a large open space. And they're required to be synchronized if you have multiple appliances, again, to address the issue of potential triggering of seizures for individuals because of the inconsistent, if the pulse rate and the appliances were going off at a different rate, they could trigger a seizure for somebody with photosensitivity. Area of refuge are areas that are required in buildings that do not have fire sprinkler protections. If your buildings have fire sprinkler protections in them, you would not be required to have an area of refuge. These are areas that provide fire and smoke protection for individuals who are not able to use the stairs. This could be somebody who uses a wheelchair. It could be somebody with arthritis that cannot walk up and down the stairs. Somebody who's had a knee replacement. Somebody who has respiratory issues. Somebody who has heart disease and has difficulty and becomes easily fatigued. They must provide a direct access to an exit of the building and must have two-way communication systems that are not dependent upon hearing or voice. And signage indicating the location of all areas of refuge is required. An exit sign is required to be tactile. But as I said before, informational signage and directional signage is not required to be tactile, but must meet the requirements for character height and for contrast, etc. Water fountains are not required under the ADA, but where provided must be accessible. One is required to be at an accessible height and one at a standard height. So if you provide a water fountain, you basically have to have one at the accessible height and one at a standard height. You cannot use just one water fountain to meet everyone's requirements. This is because you can't discriminate against people who can't bend over and use the accessible water fountain. The eye diagram on the left gives you the specifications in terms of knee clearance, toe clearance, etc. Of a water fountain and the spout height for that water fountain. The diagram on the right just illustrates that what we're seeing a lot now are bottle filler options and things of that nature. If you have those, they need to be with and available on the accessible version of your water fountain, not the inaccessible version of or the higher version of your water fountain. Now, some people have, and the ADA does talk about the fact that you can do equivalent facilitation. And we have seen entities who have chosen to only have one water fountain and use a cup dispenser, use the bottle water fountain with the accessible water fountain, and they use a cup dispenser next to it, which allows somebody who cannot bend over to use the water fountain to use the bottle filler to fill up a glass of water for drinking instead. Problematic with that can sometimes be issues of maintenance to make sure that you're filling up the cup dispenser all the time, as well as waste, and cleanup and things of that nature. So it really is something that entities have to talk about and decide what works best for them. Looking at your circulation desk or any service desks, one of the requirements under the ADA is to ensure that a portion of the counter must be at least 36 inches long and not more than 36 inches above the floor. That is a lowered portion for individuals to be served who use wheelchairs or might be of shorter height, somebody who might be of short stature due to their disability, etc. If you are an existing facility and you have not undergone renovation of this particular area that would have triggered the ADA's requirements, an alternative would be to provide an auxiliary counter nearby, or we've also seen entities who have constructed and put a fold-down shelf on their service desk as an option for individuals to be served at a lower counter as well. Seeing more and more self-service areas and kiosks within libraries, et cetera, that need to be addressed as well in the ADA's requirements. Any self-service areas must have clear floor space for a front or side approach. All operable parts must be within the reach range, which is that 48 inches maximum that I was talking about earlier in regards to the bathroom fixtures and things of that nature. Any electronic or interactive activities must be able to be operated with a keyboard input. You cannot rely on touchscreen or anything of that nature. If I'm an individual with a disability who is blind, that touchscreen is going to be meaningless to me. If I have limited hand function, that touchscreen is going to also be meaningless to me. So I must be able to provide keyboard input and not just mouse input either. Keyboard input, and that gets into our requirements for electronic accessibility, which is a whole nother topic not to be covered today. I also must have an auditory output option if I'm using anything so that somebody would be able to plug in an earphone. I'm not required to provide them that earphone, but I need to have an auditory input option where they could plug their own ear jack into it. And that would also need to be at an accessible height for them to be able to locate and to be able to use. So as you use these and you look at more technology, be able to think about the physical requirements required for those things, as well as the electronic or digital accessibility requirements. Reading and study areas, at least 5% or a minimum of 1 must be accessible. This includes any fixed seating, any movable tables or study carrels that you have. So make sure that you are looking at accessibility in this arena as well, and ensure that you have clear floor space and that you have turning radiuses so that individuals can change direction, can do a T-turn minimally, which goes back to that earlier slide where I talked about circulation paths and how you would look at your minimal clearances and maneuvering clearances. Book drops are also covered under the ADA. If they're wall mounted, a maximum 48 inches above the finished floor to highest operating part. We recommend a no higher than 36 inches to allow more and the majority of people to be able to access this. If it's a freestanding device, again, maximum 48 inches above the finished floor to the highest operable part. And also, if possible, we would recommend a lower option if it is available. Drive-up book drops are not covered under the ADA, similarly to the fact like things like drive-up ATMs, et cetera, because it's intended that individuals would be in a vehicle when they were using that drive-up book drop, and there are no standards to address the vehicle height and mountings of things that are accessed through or by a vehicle. Even if somebody might walk up to it, if it is intended to be a drive up, you would not be covered under the ADA. The fact that somebody may choose to walk up to it does not trigger your requirements, similar to the fact that if a drive-in eating place has a drive-up window and they have people who want to use their wheelchair and drive up to the drive-up window, they can refuse them service at that window. So how do you know how accessible your library is? Things that you should be looking at and doing are identifying where your barriers exist and document that. To conduct a review of all your facilities and identify what barriers you can currently have, document what those barriers are. Then move on to developing a plan for removing those barriers, long or short term. It could be a 5-year plan. It could be a 10-year plan for some of your more major limitations, and document it. Develop that plan, have timelines on that plan, have responsible parties or persons or positions for doing that, and any projected costs for removing those barriers. Communicate with your customers and seek their input about priorities for barrier removal. You want to look, you're going to come up with potentially a list that can be overwhelming of the things that we need to address. How do we know where to start first? Really strongly recommend using the voice of your customers and getting feedback from the users who are impacted by these barriers to find out what are the most critical and most important things for them to be able to access, and have that guide your barrier removal prioritization process. Monitor your progress and document. I can't tell you how much having a plan and moving forward on it and documenting it can help you in situations where you might have complaints that are filed against you. When you show good faith effort that you've actually identified the barriers and you have a plan to remove those barriers, it goes a long way to show that you are serious and that you're doing something versus not having not done anything and trying to defend yourself as to why not. And please, please, please ensure that accessibility is part of any future planning for your programs, events, and constructions. Doing it after the fact is always going to be more expensive. Being proactive, thinking about it, integrating it into your planning process, not as an afterthought, not as a, oh, did we consider accessibility? Make sure that in your planning and your checklists of your events, activities, etc., that accessibility is front and center to everything that you do. There are a variety of different resources that are available to you to assist you along this process and to better understand what the requirements are under the ADA. One of those is the checklist for facility access, which is a checklist for existing facilities. So looking at your facilities as they currently are, it's based on the 2010 ADA standards. Going through this checklist, it's an online checklist, and I provided the website www.adachecklist.org. And on that, you can download forms that you can use. You can use fillable PDF forms or Word forms that are provided for you. You can also do it right online on the website itself as you go along. I see many individuals who will load it onto their tablet and will walk around their building and record things in real time as they're doing it right onto the tablet. It also provides a lot of information about suggested remedies to barriers that you might face in existing facilities. So really strongly recommend looking at using this tool. There's also really good online guidance by the U.S. Access Board on the ADA standards. They have many different guides. They have many different animation videos that will actually show you and help you understand better why it's important that signs are mounted in a certain place. Why is it important that the toilet room is a certain size? Why is it important that door clearance is used by, and how it shows you how a person with disabilities maneuver, et cetera. It really is helpful to better understand why some things are or exist in the ADA standards. So these are excellent resources available to you. The U.S. Department of Justice also has excellent information on their website. They have a technical assistance line as well, as does the U.S. Access Board, which is primarily responsible for the implementation of the 2010 ADA accessibility standards for new construction and alterations. They have a helpline available Monday through Friday, as well as they have an email and a website that you can visit with a wealth of resources I indicated on that previous slide. We also would recommend you contact our office, the Great Lakes ADA Center. We have a telephone, 800-949-4232, which is available from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Monday through Friday to ask questions. You don't even have to identify who you are. We will assist you in any way that we possibly can. You can send us an email at adagreatlakes@uic.edu, as well as visit our website, which has a wealth of resources and information at www.adagreatlakes.org. And this program is sponsored by a variety of different entities here, the Wisconsin Public Library System. This is part of the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction all come together as part of this Library Buildings and Spaces project. Thank you very much.